So, good morning. So, the topics that I'll be presenting today are about React components. So, React components are building blocks of user interface. They are visible parts of the app. So, there are mainly two types. That is, first one is class components, and the other one is function components. Now, let's look at class components. So, this includes extends React.component statement, and they have their own internal state. This component also requires a render method that is being used. So in this, for the example, we use the class named as car and has a render function which returns hi, I am a car statement. Next, we move on to function component. In function component, it returns HTML. It's very easy to understand and it uses hooks to manage the state. So hooks are basically they allow you to use the state and other features without a class component. So this kind of a component is written with much less code, and you need to use the function keyword like as we have used in the example for function car. Next we have is rendering a component. So rendering in React refers to the process of converting React components into DOM nodes to display onto the web page. This is process of displaying a component output in user interface. It involves component structures defined in code into actual HTML statements so that the browser can display it. Next is components and component. This is the process of using one or more components in another component. It allows you to build complex UI with reusable components. This also follows the concept of parent-child component, where parent contains one or more child components. So here we have a function named car, and we also have another component called garage. Next, let's move on to React classes. This is similar to what I've explained so far about components, and these are like traditional way to define components in React before the function of the components and hooks. So class components use, as I mentioned earlier, use extend React.component and must have a render method. But also function components are almost equivalent to class components, so therefore we almost never use a class component in React. Next, let's move on to component constructor. So these are special methods used in class for initializing state and binding methods. So these are also used to set up initial values and it binds event handlers. So we have an example here. Here, car is the class component that extends React.component and inherits React's functionalities. So the constructor used is to initialize the component state. We have a super function which calls the parent class constructor. Then this dot state here, it is used to manage components internal data. And we also initialize the object with color as red. Next, let's look at class component state. So class component state manages the internal data that class component can maintain and manage. And this state object is where you store property values that belongs to the component. State is typically initialized inside the constructor method of a class component. It's usually stored in the form of key value pairs that represents the component's dynamic data. Now changing the state object. To change the state of the component, you use the set state method. This allows you to update the state to re-execute the component. It also allows the components to be reactive by changing the UI in response to user interactions. You cannot directly modify the state. You need to use setState to update the values. SetState method merges the new state with the existing state. Now let's move on to the final topic, that is lifecycle of components. So lifecycle of components is a sequence of methods that are invoked during the different stages of a component's existence. So there are three main phases. One is mounting, updating, and last one is unmounting. Let's look at mounting. So mounting means putting elements into the DOM. It occurs when the component is first initialized. So this has four built-in methods. The first one is constructor. This is called before anything else when the component is first initiated. Then we have get derived state from props. This method is called before rendering the elements in the DOM. Render is the method that actually gives the outputs, the HTML to the DOM. It's a very important method that is used in almost every step. Component did mount. This method is called after the component is rendered. Then we have updating. So updating is used when the component is updated and whenever there's a change in the component state. So this has also 5 built-in methods. First one is get derived state from props. This method is called when a component gets updated. Should component update, this method can return a boolean value that specifies whether React should continue with the rendering or not. The default value set for this is true. Then again we have render method, which is called when a component gets updated, it has to re-render the HTML, which also means re-execute. Get snapshot before update method, this method you have to access to state before the update, meaning that even after the update you can check what the values were before the update. Then we have component did update. This method is called after the component is updated. Now last we have unmounting. This phase is life cycle is when the component is removed and or like unmounted, as the React likes to call it. This has only one built-in method, that is component will unmount. This method is called when a component is about to be removed. I hope you understood these topics. Thank you so much.